Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. All right, I see lots of yeses. So that's good. It means we're in business. My name is Bianca Montrose-Moorhead, and I am the co-chair of Eval Youth. Before I turn the floor over to Michael, who will be giving us a very exciting presentation on big data and evaluation, I would need to take a few minutes to cover some introductory materials. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do, because I know we have some new folks with us, is to explain how to use the virtual platform. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is select your language. And to be able to do so, you should have something that at the bottom of your screen where you can choose your language. And all you do is you click on it to select your language. And today's webinar will be broadcast in English with simultaneous translations in Spanish, Russian, and French. So if you don't want to listen to it in English, you can choose any of those other languages and you should hear the translators. So the other thing I'd like to explain is how to interact on the platform and during the webinar. So we have a general chat box that you can use. I see many of you have been introducing yourself and letting me know, of course, that you can hear me. And so you can use this chat box actually to make comments about Michael's presentation. Also, if you have questions while he is giving his presentation, please put them in the chat box because we'll use those during the question and answer portion for today. So please make use of the chat box. The other thing I'll mention about the chat feature is if you need to translate what's being written, there is translation in the chat box as well. And so if you need to translate it into a different language, all you have to do is hit the word translate. That is right above where the comment appears. So you can do that and it will translate for you. Okay, so now that I've covered how to use the platform, a little bit about how we got here to our 6th e-learning webinar. So Eval Youth was founded in 2015, in November, in fact, in Nepal. In early 2016, a number of task forces were created, one of which is a task force that actually is charged with bringing you e-learning webinars. And also they put on the virtual conferences that some of you may have attended. We actually hosted our very first virtual conference in December 2016. We have held one every single year since then. And in fact, we will be holding another one later this year. We also launched our e-learning webinar series in October 2017. And so as I mentioned, this is the 6th one. So we've had 5 other ones before this. And so this is our roadmap for how we got here. So a little bit about who is on the webinar with us. So when I pulled the registration data a week ago to just get some general characteristics, we had 473 participants registered. I checked before I got on and the number is up to 531, so quite a big response. The other thing I did was I used maps to actually map where everyone is joining from. And so on the map, you'll actually see the locations of those who have registered and where they're located across the globe. And in terms of characteristics, the mean age of those of you who are joining is 35. The median number of years of experience you have in evaluation is 3. And remember, the median is the middle number. And then only about a third of you, or 30%, are part of a VOPE. And for those of you who don't know what that term means, it just means volunteer organization for professional evaluation. I'd like to acknowledge a few people and organizations today. So, of course, we are here. We are a network of eval partners, and so we certainly want to acknowledge them. We also want to acknowledge the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. It was through their generous financial support that we're able to hold this webinar. And then, of course, thanking Michael Bamberger for giving us his time today. We're really excited to have you with us. In terms of leadership for Eval Youth, on this slide, you'll see the 3 leaders of Eval Youth Global. Myself is one of them, and then you see the other 2 there. Also, there are 3 leaders that sort of help organize the work of Task Force 3, which is a task force that's charged with putting on virtual conferences and e-learning webinars. And so you see the 3 of them there. If you've been following us, you probably recognize their names as well. And then, of course, this work is not possible without the hard work of volunteers. And so these are other Task Force 3 members who volunteer and actually work behind the scenes to make things like this happen. So also want to thank them as well. We are pretty active on social media, so if you have not connected with us on our social media accounts, please do so. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, but you can also connect with us other ways. We do have a dedicated email address, evalyouth@gmail.com, and of course we have a website as well, which is listed here. Okay, so now on to why you're all here today. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Bamberger. And if you don't know Michael, let me tell you a little bit about him. So Michael Bamberger has a PhD in sociology from the London School of Economics. He has been involved for over 40 years in the evaluation of development programs in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Over the past few years, he has worked on the opportunities and challenges for integrating new information technology into the evaluation of development programs. Since 2001, he has been on the faculty of the International Program for Development Evaluation, where he has offered workshops on complexity, gender and development, and mixed methods. He's also published quite a bit on using big data in evaluation, and so that's also part of the reason we asked him here today. So with that introduction, let me turn the floor over to Michael.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Are my slides on now? There's bonjour à tous y buenos días a los colegas de América Latina y bonjour a gente do Brasil. I'm sorry I don't speak Russian. So what we're going to be talking about today are the opportunities for integrating big data into the evaluation of development programs. This is a field which I'm sure most of you will have heard about, but maybe you're not very familiar with the details of how to use big data. So I'm going to be going through explaining what big data is, some of the ways it's already being used in development, and some of the opportunities for integrating it into development evaluation, and particularly giving some examples of how it can be used for evaluating youth programs. So this is the program for the session. So this is the agenda of what we're going to be trying to cover. An introduction to big data. What is it? giving some examples of the increasing applications in many areas of development, talking a little bit about why evaluators have been slower to take up big data than have their colleagues in the operations department. This is an interesting message for the future. Then a little bit about the tools of data science, and the most important part is the potential applications of big data for evaluating youth programs, and I'll try to give 3 examples of how you could use different big data techniques, methods in evaluating your programs, and then just to finish with a few messages about some of the lessons hopefully we've learned from the session. So this is what we're going to try to cover. So first, what is big data? And the important message is that we're all creating big data all of the time. We're creating what some people call digital trails. So when we do a Google search, this gives information on what is on our mind, what are we thinking about. When we use Facebook, how do we like to present ourselves to our friends and family? When we use Twitter, what's in the news? When you use a credit card, there's information on what we buy. When you use a mobile phone, not only does it have a message, but also you can find out where people are. And also, as we'll see, the amount of airtime which people buy for their phones is being used as an indicator of changing levels of poverty. Then we'll be talking about satellite images, where we can find out how we migrate, the quality of our houses in our communities, how much energy we're using, many other things. And then finally, biometric data, all of the magical information we can get from our smartphones and our smartwatches on our health, what we're eating. So we're providing a lot of information on ourselves as well, which is beginning to be used quite widely for planning communities based upon these kinds of feedback. So we're already in the midst of big data. So these are just some of the sources of big data which we'll be talking about: satellite images and remote sensors, GPS location data on your phone telling where you are, social media data from Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, many other sources, radio calling programs, which are very important in a lot of parts of the world, internet search data, what are the kinds of things we're looking for when we go to internet, biometric data, ATM transaction records. Every time we go to a cash machine, there's a record of how much money we've taken out. And then PDF files, there's some very interesting developments of being able to merge lots of different information sources into an integrated data platform where you can begin to find patterns of relationships which you previously couldn't detect. So there's lots of very powerful big data sources which are becoming available, and we'll be giving examples of these as we go along. So what do we mean by big data? It's huge, and data becomes available very fast, and often it's available continuously. The data is too large to analyze on a single computer. You need a interconnected set of computers to be analyzed, the billions of Twitters which are being generated, the billions of records of ATM transactions, phone calls, and so on. A very important characteristic is that big data is non-reactive, in the sense that you're analyzing data which has been generated for another purpose. So, for example, if you're analyzing tweets, this is a communication which people have already made. So the fact that you're looking at it doesn't affect the information which is there, which is very different if you're conducting a survey. When you ask a question, you're interacting with somebody, so the way you ask the question may change how they respond. But big data is non-reactive. You're using data which has been created previously. And also, you're able to interconnect multiple sources of data through computer systems. So just the range of data which you have access to is very greatly increased. All right. So I'm sorry, it's jumped over one of the slides, which was just talking about some of the benefits of big data. That it's very cheap and easy to use. You cover the whole of the population, not just a sample as you normally do with a survey. You're able to get access to information on difficult topics, groups which are difficult to reach for security or other reasons. And so that's very important. You can also observe behavioral change and processes of how projects are being implemented. So there's a lot of very powerful benefits. Also, a lot of big data is becoming longitudinal. Now with satellite images, for example, you may have a 20-year record of changes in crop patterns or forest cover. So you're beginning to get longitudinal data as well, which is something you can't normally get with the evaluations. So there's a lot of very exciting uses of big data. At the same time, there are some challenges which is important to remember. Even though the data claims to cover the whole of the population, often it's incomplete. There's often gaps which you have to be aware of. Something very important is a selection bias. You may have millions of tweets to analyze, but not everybody uses Twitter. Not everybody has a phone. So you have to remember that very often the information you're getting from social media, for example, comes more from urban areas, more from wealthier people, more from better educated people. So you have to remember there's some biases. And then a lot of the data is dirty. You need to spend quite a lot of time cleaning it, weeding out a lot of things which may not be relevant to what you're looking at. So there's quite an investment of time in making the data available. Then it's very important to realize that most big data, it relies on indirect measures. If you conduct a survey and you ask somebody about how they're feeling, they're telling you directly. If you're using analysis of Twitter or Facebook, you're making inferences from what people have written about what they feel. And as we'll see, there's lots of challenges. People may be sarcastic. They may be trying to create an impression of themselves on social media that they're younger, they're more attractive than they really are. So you have to remember you're using indirect measures. Then we'll be talking about algorithms. These are the very sophisticated analytical tools which are used, for example, for helping to select people for jobs, for selecting people who are applying for university, for the police to identify what are the areas of high crime that they should focus on. And these are becoming very powerful, very widely used tools by decision makers. And it's important to remember that some of these have a bias against, for example, against poor people. So algorithms are very powerful, but they may have a bias. So just as an example, what does the data really mean? So you have a teenage girl who receives a selfie from a friend and she replies, "You look really great in that dress." But what does she mean? Maybe she means, "How could you wear such an awful outfit?" Or maybe she does mean it's a really beautiful dress. So her friends know whether she's being sarcastic, but you as the analyst don't know. So one of the big challenges of using a lot of this data is how to identify things like sarcasm or slang. So there's a lot of care needs to go into how you're interpreting the data. So remember what you're reading and what the data really means. There may be a gap. So this is one of the many interesting books talking about the problems of using algorithms for selecting who should be eligible for government welfare programs, who should be eligible for being selected to go to university. And this book is called Automating Inequality, how high-tech tools profile, police, and punish the poor. So this gives many very worrying examples about how these supposedly magical algorithms can be very misleading. They can be excluding ethnic minorities, poor, from being selected for government services or for access to loans or to jobs or to education opportunities. So always be be careful. This is a very interesting book to read if you want to get a little bit more depth. So just to summarize what it is we mean when we talk about big data, new information technology, there's three kinds of data. There's big data, which we've been talking about. There's information you get from your cell phones, which is information and communication technology, from cell phones, laptops, and from remote sensors. And then there's also the Internet of Things, all of the feedback you get from your refrigerator, recording how much food you've used, what your health is, what your mobility patterns are. So these three kinds of information are combined into new information technology. All of this is very large and complicated data, which is very difficult for people like us to use directly. So you need data analytics to transform this into a structure that you can use. So the data is transformed. You can do some basic analysis, and then there's lots of very sophisticated kinds of data analytics we'll be talking about a little bit. And then the outputs are processed data, which you can use yourself if you want to do some analysis of social media. There's data visualization, all of these interactive maps and charts, which you can put your finger on and find out what the situation is in a particular region of a country. And then there's the algorithms, which we were talking about. So there are these three kinds of data which all come into this new information technology system, which is what we're going to be talking about. So just to give a few examples of how big data is being used in international development by all of our colleagues. So just a few very quick examples. Big data is being used for early warning systems, for natural and man-made disasters, for detecting areas of hunger, of disease, of increasing ethnic tension. It can be used for emergency relief. GPS maps can be used to identify areas where the victims have been affected by earthquakes or by flooding. Crowdsourcing can be used for getting rapid feedback from very, very large numbers of people. The UNDP used crowdsourcing for identifying some of the priorities, their development programs in Africa, where they got feedback from over 100,000 people. So crowdsourcing can be a very powerful tool. Then there's a dissemination of information to small farmers, to women traders, to mothers, to other groups, where you can provide information on health, on market prices. For example, you can, a farmer, a fisherman, when he's still out at sea, can call and find out what are the prices of fish in different markets. So before he even comes to land, he knows what is the best place to go to sell his fish. Then you can get feedback from marginal and vulnerable groups. This gives voice to a lot of groups who don't normally have access to mass media. One interesting example, organizations like UNICEF have handheld devices that students can confidentially communicate information if they're being forced at school to trade sex for better school grades, or if people want to complain about corruption. So there's a lot of very interesting applications there. And then, as we'll see later, there's lots of ways you can use the big data for identifying areas of high poverty. I'll be giving an example of that as well. So big data is becoming very widely used by development agencies, but our colleagues in evaluation have been much slower to take up using big data. So you find that evaluators are behind the curve in terms of using big data, even though their own colleagues in their own organization are using it for planning, for emergency relief, for communication. But evaluators feel often uncomfortable with big data. They're not familiar with the methods. They feel some of these methods don't seem professional. They may feel threatened that the big data scientists are going to take over the evaluation budget. They may have problems of accessing some of the big data. There may be weak institutional links. I was doing a study for UN Global Pulse, and we found there are many organizations which have a data development department and an evaluation department, big UN agencies, for example, organizations like the World Bank or DFID, where the big data department doesn't talk to the evaluators, and often the evaluators are not very familiar with what the big data people are even doing in their own organization. And so if you look at the curriculum, training curriculum for evaluators, it tends not to include much on big data. You don't tend to include Bayesian predictive analytics if you're studying evaluation. You tend not to learn about how to use satellite data, how to do social media analysis. So evaluators are being left a little bit behind, which is an issue which we'll come back to. So this is something we could think about in the discussion time, why that is and why it matters. So briefly, what are some of the tools of data science? Very briefly, there are 4 stages which are used in the data analytics for analyzing big data. This is an oversimplification, of course. You begin with descriptive and exploratory data, where you look at the patterns in the existing situation, what is happening in the communities where we're working before a project begins. You can pull together a range of different kinds of data. You can see some new patterns which you hadn't previously been able to identify. And then the second stage is a prediction. What is likely to happen? If we have some school feeding programs, who is likely to attend school as a result of this and who won't? If there's increasing poverty, who are the groups who are most vulnerable to this? Who are the groups who are most likely to get involved in violent behavior? And then the third stage, which is very exciting, is detection. You can actually begin to identify individuals or small groups who are likely to be benefiting from or negatively affected by particular kinds of programs. So you can detect individual people or small groups where you may want to intervene to try to, for example, the groups who are most likely to be having problems with the police. You can identify these groups and try to intervene before the problems get too serious. And then the fourth stage is the evaluation and prescription. What should be done about the things you've found? So those are just, again, the 4 stages of the data analytics cycle, which we just mentioned. So some of the tools of big data, just go through very quickly. There's exploratory tools. What is the situation at the moment? Just pulling together lots of data which previously didn't have access to. Descriptive analytics, doing things like correlations and looking at the associations between different kinds of data. And then there's a whole range of very powerful predictive analytics tools where you can begin to predict what is likely to happen based upon the data which you have now and from the past. And there's a whole range of things you may have heard of: machine learning, neural networks, Bayesian analysis. These are all quite sophisticated techniques for predicting what is likely to happen. It's one of the potentially very exciting areas of big data. Machine learning, you teach machines to look for patterns, and the machine will then go through all of the data and begin to identify associations. If you're trying to identify what are factors which may affect successful outcomes, the machine will go through and try and identify these patterns for you. Then there's social media analysis, which I'll be giving an example in a moment. All of the things you can do with the Twitter, Facebook, these other kinds of social media. Then social network analysis, you can look at structures in communities, power structures, communication structures, leadership structures, influence, how information gets communicated in particular communities, and you can measure how these change as a result of your interventions. And then finally, you can use some of the traditional experimental and quasi-experimental designs. You can use these for online digital evaluations. So I'd like to spend the rest of the time in my presentation talking about some of the potential applications of big data for evaluating youth-focused programs. These are just some of the many kinds of youth programs. You're familiar with these, and I'm sure you could suggest many more. So I'm going to give examples from three kinds of big data analysis: social media analytics, mobile phones, satellite images, and triangulation. And these are just three examples, but just to try and give you a flavor of the exciting potential with using these different methods. So firstly, the social media analysis. You can use this for assessing the effectiveness of online programs, for example, for girls' empowerment, which organizations like Girl Effect use a great deal. You can assess the effectiveness of programs that encourage youth to register to vote. I was looking at recent studies in Mexico and South Africa. You can assess the effectiveness of campaigns to increase awareness about the mistreatment of indigenous populations, ethnic minorities. There's a study recently in Canada looking at. You can track hostility to women workers or ethnic minorities in factories. For example, in Indonesia, social media analysis was used to identify increasing hostility to women workers, complaints that they were taking away their jobs from men and so on. So these are some of the many things which you can do with social media analysis. So I'd like to just give one example of how this works in practice. So this might be an example of a campaign to promote gender parity among political party candidates. In other words, getting more women candidates selected by the parties. And so this program involves social media campaigns, rallies, demonstrations, and how you might use social media. Firstly, you identify the social media platforms widely used by the target group. In this project in Mexico, Twitter was the most widely used, so the analysis was done on Twitter. You then identify the hashtags relating to the campaign. These are translations from the Spanish with hashtags like showing the way, gender equality, women unite, gender parity. So you identify all of the hashtags, which can take a long time, and then you do analysis of these, the frequency of using the different hashtags, sentiment analysis, are the comments about the campaigns positive or negative, and you look at the demographics of who is participating in the different hashtags. And then you compare the frequency of use, the types of tweets, sentiment before and after your campaign to see whether your campaigns are having an effect on people's intention to vote. There was another similar study done in South Africa recently. And you always try to combine your social media analysis with mixed methods where you use surveys, in-depth interviews, case studies. Never rely, if you can avoid it, just on the social media. It has certain kinds of bias. It's giving certain kinds of information, maybe misleading on others. So try to combine this with other kinds of methods which evaluators are familiar with. So this is just a simplified example of how you might use social media for evaluating a political campaign. It could be evaluating a campaign for promoting education, sexual health. You can imagine many, many different areas. So the second example is from mobile phones and dedicated handheld communication devices, which we've mentioned. So we talked already about how you can provide an instrument for young people to provide feedback on sensitive issues like sexual harassment. The amount of airtime which people purchase for their phones proves to be a very good indicator of changing levels of poverty. So tracking how much airtime people buy at different times of the year can be quite a useful indicator for tracking things like poverty. GPS enabled phones can be used to track migration, to locate refugees who've been forced to relocate due to threats or to hunger. So it's a very useful way of tracking people who are moving around the country. You can also track the effectiveness of health messages which are delivered through the smartphones. Do people receive the messages? Do they act on them? For example, do mothers follow up and go to the clinic if they've received health messages? Do farmers use the information on recommended fertilizers, seed varieties, etc.? So you can both see whether they've received the messages and whether they followed up on them. And then for those of us who work in areas of high risk or which are very difficult to reach, phones can be a very useful way of being able to communicate with and interview people in areas which it might be dangerous or very difficult to reach, or where people wouldn't want to be seen with an outside interviewer. So these are very powerful tools for addressing sensitive issues, getting into areas which often you might not be able to reach with conventional evaluation methods. So again, one example of how to use this technology. This is an hypothetical example of assessing the effectiveness of online programs, giving advice to young migrants who are seeking employment. There's a lot of countries, as Afghanistan and Bangladesh are just two, where lots of young people migrate on a seasonal basis looking for work. So this is a hypothetical program, but based on a lot of real programs, where apps on your phone are providing guidance to young people on how to seek jobs when they migrate. And so the first thing you might do is identify who is using the app and who is not using the app on their phones. Then you monitor the amount of airtime which people are purchasing before and after they migrate, to give you an idea of how their poverty level is changing as a result of the migration. You can track the migration patterns through their phones of where do they actually go to, which cities, which towns are they going to, the areas which were recommended. Then you can track the effects of the migration on their employment patterns. The phones can tell you where somebody's phoning from. So, for example, if somebody has moved to Dhaka, Bangladesh, and if 3 days after they've moved, they're calling from the railway station, this means it's quite likely that they weren't able to find a job, and so they're in the railway station begging. On the other hand, if the phone calls are coming from the garment industry sectors of the city, this probably means that they've been able to get a job in the garment sector. All of these methods, you're using inference. You don't know they've got a job in the garment sector, so you're assuming if that's where the phone calls are coming from, probably they've got a job there. And then you can compare the situation before and after they've moved in terms of the airtime purchased as an indicator of their changes in their economic situation. You can compare the people who've used and haven't used the app. So again, this is enabling you to use an experimental or quasi-experimental design where you're comparing people who have and haven't used your apps to see whether this has had an effect on employment. Then again, try to include a mixed method design where you're including phone records with interviews, focus groups, etc. So again, this is an example of some of the things you might be able to do with using mobile phones for evaluation. And the third and final example is satellite images and remote sensors. These can be used for monitoring the numbers of people using public water supply, entering buildings such as schools and clinics. You can track the distances people walk to collect water. You can estimate the level of poverty in a community by the number of houses with thatched roofs, for example, if that's a good indicator in some countries. You can track migration patterns. You can monitor changes in farming, in forest cover over time by looking at the satellite images and the remote sensors. So these are some of the kinds of things which you can do with satellite images. And again, an example of how you can combine satellite images with several other indicators to try and triangulate estimates of poverty by comparing the estimates from 5 different sources. So firstly, the satellite images, some of the estimates of poverty which you might be able to use. You can see the number of lorries which are delivering products to markets on market days. So if there are more lorries, this probably means there's more goods to be sold. If there are less lorries, maybe the times are getting tougher. People have less things that they can sell. The intensity of light at night from villages or small towns is a good indicator of the economic level. Villages which have more electricity are probably better off, so it's possible with a satellite to measure the intensity of the light, gives you a useful indicator of poverty levels. How people travel to work, If they're walking, they're probably poorer than if they're able to take public transport or private transport. The quality of housing construction, you can see what the roofs are made of, and if roofs are made of zinc, people may be better off than if the roofs are made of thatch. Now, again, this depends on the particular community. So this is just one example, but you can see a lot of the exciting indications you can get from satellite images. You combine this with withdrawals from ATM machines. If people withdrawing more money, this may mean that they're better off than areas where they're withdrawing less money. You can track online purchases of seeds and fertilizer. Again, the online airtime phone purchases, again, is a good indicator of poverty. Social media, the frequency of keywords like hunger or food is, again, an indicator of increasing poverty if more people are talking about hunger. Again, this is indirect estimates. For example, there may be a lot of references to hunger because a lot of kids may say, I was watching the movie Hunger Game last night. It's a really great movie. So you have to be very careful how you interpret. This is the first indicator. It may be more hunger, but it may be they've just seen a movie they liked. You can get indicators of ethnic tension. So these are 5 different indicators which you could use of poverty, which you can triangulate and compare them all and come up with your best estimate of what is happening to the economic situation in a country. As you can imagine, you can use this before and after you've had a program intervention to see whether there are changes. So the final slide, just to give us a few key messages from this very rapid presentation. What are some of the takeaways? Firstly, there are a lot of big data tools which are available to strengthen evaluations. Most young people use social media, so this is a very powerful resource for evaluation. People of my generation, they're still struggling to fathom out how to use your cell phones, but young people, my grandkids, for example, they've got 3 digital devices going all of the time. So this is a very much part of young people's lives and an effective potential evaluation tool. A key message, however, is don't get too excited about these shiny new toys. Really think carefully, is there a value added of using big data? Is there a need for it? Is it addressing the kind of questions you need to use in your evaluation? Can it be better and cheaper than the information you're getting from traditional sources? Again, don't get too excited with the shiny new toys. Do they really address the things that you need? And then finally, always try to use mixed methods and triangulation. Never trust just one tool or one indicator. So finally, from all of this, really take a good look at big data. If you're an evaluator, really try to understand some of the potential uses combined with the tools which you're already using. Never just become a fanatic and say, I'm only going to use big data, but really look and see whether it has things which will be useful to you. So this is my quick overview of big data, and I hope you'll see there are some exciting possibilities and also some challenges that need to be addressed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate they've been asked. Is in so to analyze goals.
Well, thank you for the very interesting questions. In terms of who can use big data, there's, as I showed on the chart, there are sort of two levels. When big data is initially produced, there are millions or billions of pieces of data from Twitter, from satellite images. So to be able to analyze the raw data, you need very large data systems, analysis systems. But there are many services which are transforming this data into a way that you can use as an individual evaluator. For example, Twitter, Facebook, Google, just to mention three, they all have apps so that you can analyze the data yourselves. So if you're doing this study of the influence of a campaign to get more people to register to vote, you can identify, you can go into the data, you can identify the hashtags which you think are interesting, and there are free analytical tools which you can use to analyze the data. Google Maps, again, has free apps that will help you to look at a lot of the data. Satellite images, NASA makes available free, a lot of their maps. So all of this data, not all of it, but a great deal of it is being transformed into a way that individual evaluators can use. One of the challenges I'll just mention, we don't have time to go into, is it's often difficult for you to know how, if you're using data which has been processed, exactly how the data was being processed, particularly when you get into using algorithms. So you don't have access to the original data, so you always have to be careful, thinking, are there any potential biases? Are there any kinds of data which might have been excluded by the way that the service was analyzing the data for you? But just many kinds of big data are transformed into a way that you, as an individual evaluator, can use yourself. So that's a important point. There's, if you're interested, you can go to the UN agency, the UN Global Pulse. This is the UN's big data agency, and if you just go to UN Global Pulse, you can see there and click on projects. They have about 100 examples of projects where they've used big data, so you can sort of see the kinds of data. In many cases, they tell you how the data was accessed. So it is becoming increasingly easily accessible and cheap and quick to use. Be careful with big data, with social media data. You have to spend a lot of time cleaning it and understanding what the data is before you start using it. So it's not something where you can just spend half an hour and go onto Twitter and then do an analysis. In the studies on voting intentions in Mexico, they probably spent 4 or 5 months cleaning up the data, understanding what it really meant, who was using the different kinds of social media and who wasn't. So there's some investment of time to understand what it is that you're doing with your data. As there is with a survey, it takes a long time to clean a survey, understand whether the questions make sense. But so this data is becoming increasingly available. The kinds of studies, evaluations where you can use big data, I think it's a question of your judgment, of understanding, for example, if you're thinking of using smartphones, understanding what you can do with a smartphone, what are some of the problems. If you're using social media, again, if you're working with some groups of teenage girls where you have a program to try to empower them, to give them more confidence, to encourage them to continue with their education. If you understand the group well, you understand how they use the different social media, and you can judge how useful this would be for evaluation. If you just come in as an outsider, you've no idea that this example I was giving of the sarcasm, where if a girl says, you know, you look really beautiful in that dress, if you're an outsider, you really don't know what that means. And in many cultures, there are these kinds of hidden ways of saying things, particularly if you're in a situation where there are political controls where you don't want to speak directly. So once you understand what it is you're working with, the population, how they use different media, you can then decide how it could be used. And you may decide it's not worth using. It doesn't give you any information which you couldn't get from other sources. But you always sort of think of it as one of your options, in the same way as thinking, should you use a survey or not? There isn't a correct answer. You should or you shouldn't use a survey. It depends on what you're looking at, how you think people will respond. So basically try to get a bit of background on what big data is all about, and then decide whether it would be useful for a particular study. The fact is, covering people who are not directly benefiting from a program that's very important for the evaluation. It's good to have people who are not benefiting as a comparison group, but also many programs have unintended consequences. So people who are not originally part of the program population, they may in fact be affected positively or negatively by your program. So when you're thinking about any evaluation, but certainly using big data, think about how you could capture some of the unintended consequences, which can affect often quite large numbers of people. So in other words, there's no simple yes or no answer of when or how to use big data. It's up to you to, but please don't ever just say, I've got this big data, it's really great, that's the only thing I'm going to use, it's magical, I don't have to worry about any limitations. So finally, this issue of data mining, as the questioner was saying, one of the first things you learn in evaluation is that data mining, just that if you go and fish for 100,000 correlations, 5% of them are going to be significant just for the statistical probability. So never ever just do data mining like that. There's always the accusation of people looking for a dissertation topic. You just go and do data mining, run all of these correlations, and then you just find a topic for your thesis. But in big data analytics, if you have some kind of model, some kind of framework, so you know what you're looking at, data mining just allows you to look for many, many more associations than you could ever find manually. So if it's used carefully, if you have a framework so you know what you're looking for, big data can be an important analytical tool. It's something. It's one of the points that evaluators always react against, with some good reasons. And one of the big debates around data mining, as well as with predictive analytics, is whether you need to have theory. Evaluators say you need to have a theory of change, a theoretical framework, before you know what data to collect and how to analyze it. Many big data analysts say you don't need to. You just start with your data, and the theory will be generated by the data. So it's a topic which is very controversial. And I'd just like to use this very quickly to give one other topic which continually comes up as a criticism of big data, and this is real-time evaluation. As an example, I think it was in Uganda, some people did some data analysis of social media, and they came to the Ministry of Agriculture and said, there's a lot of indications of increasing poverty in certain parts of the country. And the minister said, did your data have any bias? And the big data analyst said, sure, all data has bias, but it doesn't matter because tomorrow we'll have some new data. And this is the way that big data analysts work with data. You realize it has biases, but you'll get some new data to gradually correct the biases. But for an evaluator, this is just a terrible crime to say that this is data's poor quality, it has biases. So the minister just rejected this. This was data on millions of social media records. So potentially it was very valuable, but it might have had a bias, but the evaluator just reacted negatively because the way the data was presented. So this is partly a question of the different dialogue. If the big data analyst had come along and said, we know this data is not completely representative because not everybody uses social media, but there's millions of people are expressing this concern, maybe you should follow up with a more systematic study. So if you presented it that way, an evaluator would say, yes, this is a useful starting point, let's go and look at it. But when you come in and say we're using very bad data, but it doesn't matter, there's just a different sort of evaluation style which creates these sort of bridges, these differences between evaluators and data scientists. So back to you.